Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Tonight, a conversation with Gaylord Nelson, chairman of the Wilderness Society and former United States Senator from Wisconsin. Good evening. As recently as this afternoon, negotiations were continuing in Washington, D.C. in an effort to resolve the continuing deadlock over a wilderness bill for Idaho. Idaho Republican Senator James McClure, the chairman of the Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and Ohio Congressman John Seiberling, a Democrat who chairs the House Public Lands Subcommittee, have met twice this week in an attempt to resolve their differences over just how much Idaho forest land should be officially protected under the Wilderness Act. Obviously, the clock is running quickly on settlement of this issue before the congressional adjournment scheduled early next month. And at any time during the past week, you could get just about any possible prediction on the outcome of this issue, an issue that by almost all accounts now has badly polarized the Idaho political process. Tonight, we'll get a different view of this issue from the leader of a national conservation group that has been in the forefront of wilderness preservation battles. Our guest is Gaylord Nelson, the chairman of the Wilderness Society. Gaylord Nelson is a former United States Senator from Wisconsin. He served 18 years in the Senate, where he was a leading conservation voice. Among other things, Gaylord Nelson was the founder of Earth Day and a sponsor of the 1964 Wilderness Act. Good to have you here, sir.
Nice to be here.
As I mentioned, there is probably no more polarized political issue in Idaho right now than wilderness. Some of the polls put it at 50% of the state's residents opposed to any more wilderness designation. There's a deep concern about jobs and the possible loss of jobs due to wilderness designation. What do you say to those folks who are concerned about all of those things?
Well, of course, on the question of designation of wilderness and its relationship to job losses, there is no significant evidence that I have seen from any studies that would indicate that that has had a serious impact. Of course, of the 86 million acres of designated wilderness, 56 million is in Alaska, one state. And about 45% of all the wilderness designations are in national parks. So those designations didn't cost any jobs at all because the national parks have never permitted timbering or mining or gas and oil drilling. The parks have been established long before there was any modern environmental movement. From starting with the first national park, there has been no economic extraction of resources because the Congress and the public wanted them to remain as the crown jewels of the country. So there is not, I've looked at arguments all around this, but I've seen no substantive argument at all by the oil companies, gas companies, hard rock mineral companies, coal companies that indicated any provable case of significant job lost.
How about timber companies? That's where the concern is in this state.
Interestingly, I'm not aware of any studies that have identified, and they should be done, how many jobs depend upon sales below cost timber sales. I'm hoping that our society will do it. Should have been done a long time ago. This issue about sales below cost isn't necessarily a wilderness question, of course. But I know of no evidence that any significant evidence that the lands taken out in designated wilderness in the national forest have had any significant job impact. As a matter of fact, a lot of people in recreation located places, they produce economic income. I understand that in
due to tourism and
recreation. I understand in Idaho that I've read in your papers out here, I think that's about the second most important industry. If you destroy the beauty of the outdoors and pollute the rivers, then that industry is seriously damaged, and there are a whole lot more jobs involved there than there are in areas involving wilderness designations.
The Wilderness Society has been, certainly in Washington and to somewhat a lesser degree in Idaho, a very major force in this whole discussion of wilderness, not only in this state but in many states. What do you view as the chances of a wilderness bill dealing with Idaho's situation passing before the Congress adjourns?
I couldn't walk in here and give you more information than you really just gave. If my guess would be this, what you have here is a proposal by the congressional delegation that was around 550,000 acres. You have a proposal that's supported by the Idaho conservation groups of 3,300,000 acres. Then you have the proposal of the Fish and Game Department of the state for I think it's 1.8 million. So there's a big difference between the 550 and the 3.3 million. My guess would be, as a practical matter, if there's not agreement between the chairman of the House subcommittee, Mr. Starbeling, and the Idaho delegation, that there wouldn't be any bill this session because it's only got, what, 2-3 weeks,
right.
A few weeks to go. So they'd have to be in agreement to do it. And whether there'll be agreement, I don't know.
Okay. Let me ask you a couple more specifics about how this issue is being viewed in Idaho. There was a good deal of, well, how to describe it, concern, maybe something deeper than concern, when Congressman Seiberling was out here earlier this summer. A lot of people in Idaho view this issue as an Idaho issue. They say, we are the ones, if there will be jobs lost, there'll be Idaho jobs. If it does have an impact on the economy, it'll be an Idaho impact. And here we have a congressman from Ohio who has a major hand in deciding this issue, and congressmen from 49 other states with a major hand in deciding it. What do you say to those folks who say, basically, we know best in Idaho?
Well, I understand the argument. As a matter of fact, it gets more refined than that. In the Chequamegon National Forest in Wisconsin and the Nicolet National Forest, the people who live around the forest have a possessive view and don't want the people from Milwaukee and Madison telling them what should be done with the forest because they're living in the area. That's natural enough. These are, however, resources that belong to everybody in the United States. The National Forest, the National Parks, the Wildlife Refuges, the Bureau of Land Management lands, all belong to the people of the United States. Congress acted on the Wilderness Bill as a Congress representing all the people of the United States, recognizing that there ought to be preserved some natural areas in their natural state in perpetuity, and directed that the Forest Service review their lands and make recommendations. The same is going on in the BLM. So I understand how somebody may feel, well, if it's in my state, we ought to be the final authority. Hardly any of the congressmen, none of the congressmen from this state, my state, any other state, live in Alaska, where you have well over half of all the wilderness designations and a big portion of the parks, and the Congress voted on how much should be parks, how much wilderness, how much wildlife refuges, because these are federal lands managed by the federal government on behalf of the people of the country.
There is some sentiment apparently in the conservation community in this state now, because time is running so short on solving this issue before the Congress adjourns, some sentiment that, well, no bill would be better than a bill that we're not really satisfied with.
I think that's what I hear. I'm talking with the people all the time from Idaho, and some were in last week, and we have a regional representative here, and I'm sure that as a general proposition, the people not only just in the conservation movement, but the people who are concerned about preserving some what they would consider adequate representation of the wilderness areas in this state would rather have no bill than a very poor bill, and
take their chances with the next Congress.
Sure.
I know you have traveled obviously extensively in many states to view wilderness areas. You've been in Idaho, I know, a number of times. As a conservationist who looks at these areas and tries to decide which should we should fight over and try to preserve. What is so significant about the land that is in dispute in Idaho for you as a conservationist?
Well, Idaho is, of course, one of the spectacularly beautiful states in the Union, with magnificent rivers and scenery and mountains. And Idaho has, incidentally, more national forest roadless areas, unroaded areas, in acreage than any other state in the Union, of around 9 million acres. As one who feels strongly and has, long before there was any wilderness bill, that we ought to be preserving representative ecosystems and natural areas, that they're of great value to the country in many, many ways, I supported much more designation of wilderness than Congress has been passing. And I would continue to do so, because I think they have a great value standing on their own. We don't have to, in my judgment, cut every tree and silt every river, that there are economic values on the other side. If you take, for example, I'm dismayed by what the Forest Service did in this state back in the 60s in roading 540 miles, thereabouts, in the Payette Forest, in the watershed of the South Fork of the Salmon River. The total amount of money it was probably loss, sales below cost, although I'm asked one of our staff to check that, but the total amount of money involved was $14 million. It destroyed the salmon run, the Chinook salmon run spawning beds in the South Fork, and that represented 55% of all the Chinook salmon in the whole Columbia River system. The value of the salmon run was far greater than the value of the forest. So what rational person would really do that?
So, well, that seems to me to be one of the problems that your side, if you will, in this debate has trouble making, is you can always put an economic value on jobs, minerals, timber. It's more difficult, admittedly, to put some tangible, quantitative value on a salmon run.
Sure it is. Although that could, I suppose, the value of that salmon run in catches of the salmon coming back out of the sea to go up to spawn is probably something that's measurable. What about the recreation? What about the sports people who love to go and fish? What about the people who sell the equipment and who are attracted as tourists to the South Fork of the salmon or the Middle Fork or what have you? If their values, scenic beauty values are destroyed, if the salmon beds are silted, it's whether you can put a dollar value, you probably can't put a dollar value on it because it's worth too much. But that doesn't justify, in my judgment, making these massive sales of timber below cost. The General Accounting Office study of 4 regions in the Rocky Mountains, one and the other the Pacific Northwest, of 3,244 contracts of timber sales for 1981 and 82, the sales below cost of those 3,244, I believe it was, totaled 156 million in 2 years. That's a tremendous amount of money. And under what grounds would one justify those massive losses?
In other words, what you're saying, just to explain it in a little different terms, the costs of preparing these lands for sale, building the roads into them, whatever needs to be done, is not offset by what the federal government gains by selling the timber.
That's correct. When the studies done with the GAO is that the cost of managing that sale and the cost of the roads exceed the cost, the value of the timber. Tongass National Forest in Alaska is the worst one of all. I think that's somewhere around 90 million a year alone in losses in the past year. Well, I think that's bad economics, and it's in the bad economic policy and bad environmental policy.
Well, I'm sure you would argue that the taxpayer is losing as a result of those situations. Who's gaining?
I don't think there's, this is a relatively new problem, really. last 15 years or so. And the Forest Service plans to escalate the cut. The San Juan Forest down in Colorado gets 3 cents back for every 97 cents spent. So they're losing 97 cents on every sale. That doesn't make sense by any standard at all. Now, there will be places where sales below cost would need to be made for one reason or another, but there's no excuse for these massive sales below cost.
Senator McClure, I understand he has an amendment to a timber relief legislation, which is on the Senate floor, will be next week, and his amendment is supposed to be considered next week, that would allow some of these so-called credits that timber companies get for building roads when these sales that you talk about occur, would allow them to transfer those credits around, to use them in different places, carry them over, or perhaps even sell them to someone else.
Well, the original proposal, whether he's changed it or not, I don't know. The original proposal last year was that excess road credits could be used.
Yes,
that
right.
is to say, if you bid $100,000 on the timber and it costs you $100,000 for roads, the government gets nothing. You break evens, presumably. But if it cost $110,000 to build the roads, and there was only $100,000 worth of timber, this proposal would say that $10,000 of excess road credits then could be used by the timber purchaser on some other purchase. All that would do is fuel the machinery of bids all over the place. It would make the situation
make
it worse.
Make it worse.
Yeah, if that goes on there, the conservation organizations, so far as I know, I don't know of any who are opposed to changing the timber contracts because of the bind that a lot of companies got into bidding, and then the price dropped out of it. But if there is this kind of a road credit proposal in there, we would strongly oppose it, and I doubt very much whether Congress will buy that, but who knows?
Well, again, back to the question of who in effect benefits from this. Are the timber companies benefiting?
Well, I think what happens, no, I think the timber company isn't going to pay more than, isn't going to regularly be buying timber if they're going to lose money on it. What's happening is the government is selling it so low that the government's losing money. And I would assume the timber companies are smart enough so that they may lose on some sales, of course, but I don't think that I think it's the federal government that is losing money on these sales. But the environmental damage is the one I'm even more concerned about than that.
Let me go back just to one final question on the wilderness issue. Another argument that you hear from time to time in this state is that wilderness is essentially an elitist proposition, that it is used by basically rich people who can afford to float the middle fork of the salmon, or it's used by able-bodied people who can carry a backpack into the river of no return wilderness. What do you say to that elitist argument?
Well, you know, that's made about all kinds. I've been in the environmental movement for 36 years, 32 of them in public office. When I organized Earth Day in 1970 for nationwide demonstrations of concern about our environment, it was attacked as an elitist movement. And I pointed out to people that clean air isn't elitist. Poor people breathe the air too. Poor people drink the water. It isn't elitist. Is it elitist to say that, say, the National Symphony is an elitist movement because all the people in the country don't go to the symphony? You preserve, I think it's important economically and important from an aesthetic and spiritual standpoint that we preserve some of natural America the way it's been for 1,000,000 years. And isn't 1,000,000 years, or 10,000 if it's after the glacier, years of nature's worth saving just for itself, let alone scientific reasons, protection of watersheds, recreation for people who want to go and walk in them. I think they have a great, very high value, and if you went out on the street, I think you'd find all kinds of people in the small towns of Idaho who've walked into the Frank Church Wilderness of No Return or into the wilderness areas of your national forests. And why do people come out here? Why did I come out? I went to the Yellowstone, the Tetons this summer, up to the Sawtooth, to the Frank Church Wilderness No Return, because the scenic beauty is there, and I wanted to, and I enjoy seeing it, and though I've been in the state many times.
I want to change the subject somewhat in the time that remains and ask you about the Reagan administration's environmental record. 2 years ago, or thereabouts, the Wilderness Society, and you in particular, were really up in arms about James Watt, the Secretary of the Interior at that time. There was a substantial expectation, I think, in the conservation movement that James Watt would be a political liability for Ronald Reagan. Here we are a month before the election. You can't hardly get anybody to talk about the Reagan administration's environmental record and James Watt's old history. It didn't work out quite the way some people thought it would, did it?
Well, my interest was solely in Secretary Watt's anti-environmental policies and Burford's anti-environmental policies over in the EPA. I wasn't interested in politically one way or the other. This issue has never been partisan in this country. Teddy Roosevelt was the first of our great conservationists, and all down through history it's been Republicans and Democrats, and all the bills that have been passed in the 18 years that I was in the Senate, and that's when most of them passed, had overwhelming Republican and Democratic support and were signed by Presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. I was concerned about Watt's policies.
Didn't they make it a partisan political issue?
Yes, they did. It was the first. They made that. It was the first time we ever had an administration that made an all-out assault on the environmental laws of the country. Never had that before in history, and that's how the dispute started.
Well, as you say, an all-out assault. As you look back on Watt's tenure, what did he really do that was so bad that will leave a lasting impact on this country?
Well, I could give you a long string, but let's take just one area. Succeeding Congresses from in the 1960s all the way on up into the 80s passed authorizations for new wild rivers, for additions to the park system, for new national parks. And we had a fund that was adopted using offshore oil royalties, an earmarked fund for a maximum of $900 million a year to acquire these additions to the park system, the wild river system, and so forth. And every year we'd been acquiring them. We still aren't through acquiring some of them that were authorized, like the St. Croix River in my own state, still 4,400 acres, and that was passed in 1968. They reversed the whole thing and said we don't need any more parks. So there you sat with all of these areas in limbo, with the price going up, with some of them may never be gotten because of that. In holdings all along the St. Croix River in my state. What the administration said, and Secretary Watt said, that President Johnson, and President Nixon, and President Ford, and President Carter, and all previous Congresses were wrong when they voted these additions to the park system. They voted them because, if you look at the numbers, in 1950 there were 30 million visits to our national parks. 1980, 300 million. A 10-time increase in a 30-year period. Congress, in its judgment, and all previous presidents agreed we need addition. That's a permanent damage. And administratively and all through the system, in the BLM and all over, he's done very serious damage. And the same has happened in the EPA, and it'll take years to reverse it, even under people who are really concerned and supportive.
Well, just give me a brief thumbnail on the two replacements, Secretary Clark at Interior and Ruckelshaus at EPA. Are they starting to turn some of the damage around?
As far as I can see, there's no change in policies in the Interior Department. The
different style.
The Watt style is gone. Over on in the EPA, Mr. Ruckelshaus, whom I've known a long time and knew him when he was EPA administrator under President Nixon, is a fine man. He's a concerned environmentalist. He was brought in because of the disastrous consequences of the publicity and everything that was going on in the EPA. And he's restored morale, and he's making an effort. Nonetheless, everything major that he's asked for, the administration has turned him down on. The question of acid rain, which the National Academy of Sciences and the President's own scientific panel says needs to be tackled right now. He recommended a 4.5 million ton a year reduction, turned down by the administration. The budget has been so badly cut in EPA that he recommended just going back to the last appropriation authorization under President Carter, which because of inflation would be a 40% decrease in that purchasing power of that budget, and the administration only gave him half of what he asked. So the things that he asked that he thought needed to be done, he was turned down on. He is a better administrator, he does believe in the program, and it's far better than it was under the previous administrator.
Yet Ronald Reagan would tell us all, as he has, that he is a friend of the environment, that he cares about environmental protection, he cares about the national parks and wildlife, he cares about wilderness areas. Is all of that just a whole lot of talk?
Yes. If you walked out on the streets of Boise and you asked every single person you met for as long as you could stand there for as many days, everybody would say, yes, I'm an environmentalist. I have never in my life run into a person who said he wasn't. James Watt said he was a good environmentalist. Ann Burford said she was a good environmentalist. All the oil company executives say they're good environmentalists. But their policies don't support what anybody that I would consider a good environmentalist would agree with.
On a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being the best, where would you put them? The administration's overall environmental record.
Well, I would simply rank...
Failing record?
Yes. I would rank it the lowest of any administration in the history of this country, and I think anybody else who looks at it would say the same.
Finally, Senator, just a minute left. I know when you were in the Senate, you led the fight to ban Agent Orange as the use of Agent Orange. Just today, a federal court in Washington ruled that the government must stand trial in the case brought by Vietnam veterans over that issue. You have a comment on that?
Well, the dispute has been whether or not the government should be stuck with any of the cost of whatever damages could be proved, if damages can be proved. And I think that if there were damages, and I think there were, and it can be proved, I think both the manufacturer and the government probably should be responsible, with the manufacturer as a prime one, because there is evidence that's been brought into the picture that the manufacturers were hiding the fact that they had evidence that this was dangerous. Well, that's a pretty disgraceful thing to do when you consider you got our boys over there in Vietnam spraying it all over. And I moved to stop using it in Vietnam because of Dr. Messelson's studies at Harvard. That's 1969, I believe.
Senator Gaylord Nelson, it's very good to have you here. You're kind to take the time. We appreciate it. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back on Monday. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.